Forget everything you've seen in movies about war. The reality of soldiers' lives had nothing to do with the heroic scenes depicted in newsreels. Often, the hardest battle was not the clash with the enemy, but the daily struggle for basic human conditions. Soldiers in World War II did not sleep in warm barracks, but in icy mud, damp basements, and on frozen ground. These inhuman conditions gave rise to remarkable ingenuity, turning everyday objects into tools for survival. Heroism was manifested not only in attacks, but also in the quiet, daily struggle against sleep and cold.
On your feet! On your feet! The sun's rising!
Watch the video to the end to find out how a soldier's greatcoat was turned into a full-fledged home, and why the ability to dig a hole in the snow was valued no less than the ability to shoot accurately. What if I told you that everything you believed about soldiers' rest was not true? On the front line, the concept of uninterrupted 8-hour sleep simply did not exist. Rest was a luxury that had to be snatched from the war in 15-20-minute bursts. In conditions of constant tension and anticipation of attack, fatigue itself became the main enemy. A sentry who fell asleep at his post was a mortal threat to the entire unit. Therefore, the soldiers came up with a simple but incredibly effective system of collective security. The soldiers literally took turns sleeping, creating a living chain. One soldier would lie down to rest while his comrade stayed awake, keeping a hand on his shoulder. The slightest danger or the end of the rest period would instantly wake the sleeper with a light touch. This system was especially important for scouts and sentries who were in close proximity to the enemy. There, even the slightest sound was unacceptable. A quiet nudge from a comrade was the only permissible signal of alarm or change of guard. Such intermittent sleep was incredibly exhausting, both physically and psychologically. The body did not have time to fully recover, being in a constant state of semi-sleep. It was a huge strain on the nervous system, requiring incredible endurance. For convenience, the soldiers often slept without removing their ammunition and keeping their weapons in their hands. This allowed them to jump up at the alarm in a matter of seconds, fully ready for battle. Sleep and war merged into a single continuous state of combat readiness. Sometimes the simplest devices were used to keep track of time. A smoldering wick or a homemade candle, designed to burn for a certain amount of time, served as a silent timer. When the flame went out, it meant that the rest period was over, and it was time to wake the next person. This harsh necessity gave rise to the highest level of trust and mutual assistance. Each soldier entrusted his life to the comrade who kept watch while he slept. This unwritten rule of trench brotherhood was stronger than any charter. Such sleep on the verge of exhaustion was an integral part of life at the front. It tempered character, but also left deep scars on the soldier's psyche. It was a quiet, invisible battle that each man fought alone with himself. I am very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about the psychological impact of such a regime on a person? Write about it in the comments. Want to know the secret that saves soldiers from the cold and shrapnel? When the front stabilized, the main task was to organize daily life. And here, the ancient art of construction came to the rescue. The building of dugouts. It was not just a shelter, but a real underground house, capable of protecting against bad weather and artillery fire. Building a dugout was hard collective labor that required coordination and engineering ingenuity. It all started with digging a pit, the size of which depended on the number of soldiers. The walls were reinforced with wood, using logs, boards, or any other suitable material. This prevented the soil from collapsing and created the foundation for the future dwelling. All cracks were carefully caulked with moss, tow, or simply earth to protect against drafts. The roof was the most difficult and important element of the structure. First, several layers of logs were laid down to form a base. Then it was covered with branches, turf, and a thick layer of earth, which provided excellent camouflage and protection from shrapnel. Inside, the dugout was the pinnacle of soldier ergonomics. Along the walls, they built bunks out of boards or poles. In the center, they often installed a homemade stove, which was a source of heat and comfort. This underground dwelling was lit by smoky kerosene lamps or trench candles. The dim light created a special atmosphere, turning the dugout into a small island of peaceful life. Here, soldiers could rest, write letters home, or just talk. The entrance to the dugout was usually made in the form of a narrow corridor with 1 or 2 turns. This design, called a barrier, protected against direct hits and shock waves. The door was made of boards or simply covered with a raincoat. The dugout became a true symbol of positional warfare. It demonstrated man's ability to inhabit even the most hostile spaces. But what if I told you that often there was not even such a shelter to sleep in, and bare ice served as a bed? Read on to the next chapter to find out how soldiers slept in individual trenches. Now I'm going to tell you something you've never seen before: how soldiers turned a trench into a bedroom. A single foxhole was the main type of shelter in battle. It was just a hole in the ground, but the soldiers' ingenuity turned it into something more. The main problem with the foxhole was that it was open at the top. It protected against bullets and shrapnel flying parallel to the ground, but it was vulnerable to mortar fire and air bursts. Sleeping in such a shelter was extremely dangerous. That's when a solution was born that was ingenious in its simplicity: the foxhole. It was a small cave or niche that soldiers dug into one of the walls of their trench. It was deep enough to fit one person. Such a niche provided additional protection from shrapnel falling from above. The soldier climbed into it, like into a burrow, and found himself under the protection of a thick layer of earth. It was his personal, individual bomb shelter. The dimensions of the foxhole were minimal, exactly the height of the soldier. This was done so that, in the event of a collapse, he would not be buried under a large amount of earth. The confined space created a feeling of security, like in a cocoon. The floor of the niche was covered with straw, hay, or fir branches, if they could be obtained. This provided at least some insulation from the cold and damp ground. Often, a greatcoat or raincoat was simply laid on the bottom. The entrance to the foxhole could be covered with a piece of cloth or a raincoat. This protected against wind, rain, and snow. In his little cave, a soldier could shelter from the weather and sleep for a few hours in relative comfort. This simple niche in the trench wall saved thousands of lives. It gave soldiers a chance to rest where there seemed to be no hope of salvation. It was a small masterpiece of military engineering, born of the instinct for self-preservation. Are you ready for the shocking truth about how people survived in the trenches? In conditions where the temperature dropped below zero, the main enemy was the cold. It was more insidious and dangerous than the enemy, sapping strength and the will to resist. The simplest and most ancient way to keep warm was to sleep together. Soldiers in dugouts or earthen huts lay close together, covering themselves with whatever was at hand: greatcoats, raincoats, blankets. The warmth of human bodies created a kind of microclimate. This method was especially important during overnight stays in the field, when it was not possible to build a fire. A group of soldiers huddled together could survive even severe frost. This was a manifestation not only of physical necessity, but also of comradeship. However, in conditions of positional warfare, soldiers created more technologically advanced sources of heat. The classic solution was a stove made from an empty barrel or metal box. It heated up quickly, but also cooled down quickly, requiring constant attention. A simpler and safer solution was the trench candle. It was made from a tin can into which corrugated cardboard was rolled and filled with paraffin or wax. Such a device burned for a long time, almost without smoke, and provided a little heat and light. Several such candles could slightly raise the temperature in a small dugout or dugout. Their flame could be used to heat canned food or boil a mug of water. It was a small but vital source of comfort. Sometimes soldiers showed remarkable ingenuity in creating heating systems. Hot stones from the fire were brought into the shelter, where they gave off heat for a long time. They also used empty shell casings, filling them with hot sand. But what to do when there is no dugout or basement around, only an endless snowfield? In the next chapter, you will learn how soldiers managed to sleep right in the snow, turning it from an enemy into an ally. Ready to learn more? The winter campaigns of World War II were a real test of the human body's endurance. Soldiers had to sleep directly on the snow in extremely low temperatures. Surviving in such conditions required special knowledge and skills. The main rule was never to lie down directly on the snow. It instantly takes away body heat. Therefore, the first thing soldiers did was to create an insulating bedding. The ideal material for this was spruce or pine branches. A thick layer of branches created an air gap that prevented the cold from the snow from penetrating the body. The thicker the layer of branches, the warmer the bed was. If there were no trees nearby, anything that could provide insulation was used. Dry grass, reeds, straw, or even spare clothing were used. The main task was to separate themselves from the frozen ground. To protect themselves from the wind, soldiers dug snow shelters. The simplest of these was a snow pit, which was covered with a raincoat. This was enough to protect against the wind and snowstorms. A more complex but warmer shelter was a snow cave. It was dug in a deep snowdrift. Inside such a shelter, the temperature was significantly higher than outside and could remain around zero even in severe frost. Special attention was paid to staying dry. Wet clothes in the cold are a sure way to get hypothermia. Before going to sleep, soldiers tried to dry their footcloths and insoles as much as possible, often simply by wearing them under their greatcoats. They usually slept in full gear, without taking off their felt boots and warm clothes. The greatcoats served both as a blanket and protection from the wind. A hood or a shanka hat protected the head, through which most of the heat escapes. As in the trenches, they often slept in groups, huddled together. This allowed them to conserve precious heat. The person on duty made sure that no one froze in their sleep. Survival in winter conditions was a real science. Soldiers quickly learned these harsh rules. Their lives depended directly on their ability to organize their night's rest in the snow correctly. Ready to learn the truth about where soldiers had to sleep during urban combat? Battles in cities such as Stalingrad and Berlin turned residential buildings into ruins. It was these ruins that became temporary homes and shelters for soldiers. The safest and most preferred place to sleep was the basement. Thick stone or concrete walls and ceilings provided reliable protection from bullets, shrapnel, and even direct hits to some extent. Basements became veritable underground fortresses. However, finding a free and safe basement was a stroke of luck. Often they had to be fought for from the enemy during fierce battles. Every square meter of underground space was worth its weight in gold. Sleeping in the ruins was fraught with constant danger. Damaged structures could collapse at any moment from the vibration of passing vehicles or a nearby shell explosion. Soldiers intuitively learned to identify the most stable parts of buildings. They slept on whatever they could find. Old mattresses, sofas, and any surviving furniture that could be found in destroyed apartments were used. If there was nothing, they slept directly on the floor, covering themselves with greatcoats or scraps of cloth. Urban battles often lasted around the clock, blurring the line between day and night. Soldiers slept in short bursts during brief moments of calm. They had to rest right at their firing positions without leaving their machine guns or windows turned into embrasures. The constant dust from destroyed buildings, soot, and smoke made the air heavy. It was difficult to breathe in such conditions, but they quickly got used to it. The main thing was to find shelter from enemy fire. Windows and doorways were covered with blankets or carpets. This was done not so much for warmth as for light masking. Any ray of light at night could attract the attention of a sniper. Despite all the dangers, the stone ruins provided better protection than an open field. They provided shelter from the biting wind and precipitation. For an exhausted soldier, even a broken-down basement seemed like the height of comfort. But how did soldiers manage to keep warm in these cold stone labyrinths? In the next chapter, we will talk about the universal survival tool that every soldier had. A soldier's overcoat was not just part of his uniform. In the field, it became a universal survival tool. A soldier's health and life depended on his ability to use it correctly. First and foremost, the greatcoat was the main protection against the cold. Its thick cloth provided good protection from wind and frost. The long hem allowed the legs to be covered, and the raised collar protected the neck and face. During sleep, the greatcoat became a blanket. Wrapping oneself in it with one's head covered created a cocoon of warm air around oneself. Soldiers slept wrapped in their greatcoats in trenches, in the snow, and on the bare ground. If the situation allowed, the greatcoat was used as a mattress. Folded several times, it created a soft and warm layer between the body and the cold ground. It was a simple but effective solution. The greatcoat could also be used as a pillow. To do this, it was rolled up and placed under the head. Almost all soldiers used such improvised pillows. The Soviet raincoat tent, made of tarpaulin, was an even more multifunctional item. It served as protection from the rain, and during a break, it could be used to build a canopy or a small tent. Two raincoat tents joined together formed a shelter for several people. Soldiers often used the raincoat tent as a sleeping mat. Its waterproof fabric protected against moisture coming from the ground. This was especially important in swampy areas or in wet weather. In critical situations, a greatcoat or raincoat could be used as a stretcher to carry a wounded comrade. The strength of the material allowed it to support a person's weight. This was built into the very design of these items. Caring for the overcoat and raincoat was one of the soldiers' main responsibilities. They had to be cleaned and dried regularly whenever possible. Losing or damaging this equipment was a serious offense. This clothing, simple at first glance, was the result of many years of experience in warfare. It was as functional as possible and designed for survival in the harshest conditions. For a soldier, it was his mobile home. The movement of troops, especially on foot, was one of the most exhausting aspects of war. Marches of many kilometers with full gear took all their strength. The soldiers were so tired that they fell asleep literally on the move. During short breaks, which lasted 10-15 minutes, the soldiers would fall to the ground where they stopped. They fell asleep instantly, paying no attention to the mud, snow, or stones. Every minute of rest was worth its weight in gold. They slept in the most incredible positions, sitting with their backs against a tree or wall, lying right on the side of the road. Sometimes they fell asleep simply leaning on their rifles. There was even a concept of sleep on the go. An exhausted soldier could fall into a state of semi-sleep, continuing to mechanically move his legs and move along with the column. It was a dangerous state from which he was brought out by a push from a comrade walking behind him. When traveling in vehicles, soldiers also took every opportunity to sleep. They slept on the armor of tanks, in the beds of trucks, and on boxes of ammunition. The shaking and rumbling did not bother their exhausted bodies. The soldiers crammed into the back of the truck like sardines in a barrel. They slept sitting up, resting their heads on their neighbors' shoulders or lying down in a heap. It was uncomfortable, but it gave them a chance to regain some strength. Even at artillery positions, gunners managed to sleep in short breaks between volleys. They lay down right on the ground next to the gun. The roar of gunfire could no longer wake them. This constant lack of sleep was as much a factor of war as hunger or cold. It dulled reactions and attention, which could lead to fatal consequences. But the soldiers simply had no other choice. The human psyche has an amazing ability to adapt. Soldiers learned to switch off and fall asleep in any situation. The ability to fall asleep quickly and wake up quickly was one of the key survival skills. This sleep, interrupted by war, was incomplete and did not provide real rest. But it gave the body the minimum respite it needed. It allowed the soldier to get up and move on towards a new battle. In the field, any material that could provide at least some insulation from the cold ground was highly valued. Soldiers showed remarkable ingenuity, creating beds for themselves from the most unexpected materials. The most desirable and valuable resource was ordinary straw. An armful of dry straw was a real luxury. It could be found in abandoned villages, barns, and threshing floors. Straw was an excellent insulator and made for a soft and relatively dry bed. Soldiers stuffed pillowcases with straw or simply made a kind of mattress out of it on the floor of a dugout or dugout. Sleeping on straw was incomparably more comfortable than on the bare ground. A whole fight could break out over the right to own such a mattress. If there was no straw, hay was used instead. Its thermal insulation properties were slightly worse, but it was still better than nothing. The smell of hay reminded them of peaceful life, which had a psychological effect. In wooded areas, dry leaves were the main material for bedding. In the fall, soldiers raked them into large piles and slept right on them. A thick layer of leaves provided good protection from the cold and damp. Reeds, dry moss, and even ferns were also used. Any dry vegetation was suitable for making bedding. The main thing was that the material was dry and created an air layer. Man-made materials were also used. Old newspapers, laid in several layers under a greatcoat, provided additional insulation. In urban combat, any textiles that could be found were used. Scraps of carpets, curtains, or old clothes. The ability to find and use suitable material for sleeping was as important a soldier's skill as the ability to handle weapons. It directly determined whether a soldier would be able to rest and recover before the next battle. The most amazing aspect of a soldier's sleep was the ability of the human psyche to adapt to unimaginable conditions. In peacetime, the slightest rustle can wake a person up. In war, soldiers slept to the sound of artillery fire. A soldier's brain learned to filter out sounds. It got used to the constant background noise of battle, distant explosions, machine gun fire, and shouting. These sounds became part of the environment and no longer disturbed sleep. At the same time, their hearing remained incredibly sensitive to unusual and potentially dangerous sounds. A soldier might not wake up from a nearby shell explosion, but would instantly jump up at the quiet crack of a branch or the clang of metal, signaling the approach of the enemy. This was the unconscious work of the instinct for self-preservation. The ability to fall asleep instantly was a vital skill. Soldiers had to use every free minute to rest. They learned to switch off their consciousness on command without wasting time falling asleep. In the same way, he learned to wake up instantly. At the command rise or at the sound of an alarm, the soldier had to go from a state of deep sleep to a state of full combat readiness in a fraction of a second. A delayed reaction in war is equivalent to death. Soldiers slept with their weapons in their hands or nearby. This was not only a practical necessity, but also a psychological factor. The feeling of having a weapon nearby gave them a sense of security and control over the situation. Despite physical exhaustion, sleep did not always bring relief. Many were tormented by nightmares in which they relived the most terrifying moments of battle. War did not let them go, even in their sleep. We see that sleep in war was not rest, but another front in the struggle. A struggle against cold, dirt, fear, and extreme exhaustion. Behind every decision that seems simple at first glance, from a foxhole to collective sleep, lies an unyielding will to live and remarkable human ingenuity. These stories show us the true price that soldiers paid every day, even far from the line of fire. They prove that heroism is not only a feat in battle, but also the ability to maintain human dignity in the most unimaginable conditions. Their experience is a harsh lesson in resilience and a reminder of the value of simple things, such as a warm and safe bed. Please suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. What other aspects of soldiers' lives during World War II interest you? And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new episodes.